Millions of Europeans landed on foreign shores with knapsacks on their backs. Others were running ashore with gun in hand. The Europeans with guns weren't fighting wars, though. They were civilizing the uncivilized. During the 19th century, the leading nations of Europe developed an insatiable appetite for colonizing and expanding empires, much in the way that the expansionist French, English, and Spanish had done in the 1500s. The European nations were, of course, looking for new markets and new raw materials for manufacturing. The European powers were locked in a fierce competition, and they needed more land and more wealth. Places like Africa had just what the Europeans needed. The only problem with colonizing Africa was that Africa was inhabited by millions of native Africans. To justify taking land and resources away from other peoples, not just in Africa, but in India and other places, Europeans developed a sense of responsibility. They believed that Europe was responsible for taking civilization to the barbarians in the primitive and uncivilized parts of the world. The white man's burden, or the burden of civilized Europeans to civilize the uncivilized, made it easier for the 19th century Europeans to practice an imperialism that was in some ways similar to and in some ways different from old imperialism. In no place was this imperialism demonstrated more than in Africa. What resulted was a rush to snatch up as much land as possible before the other countries did. The late 1800s proved to be a very bad time to live in the Third World. Well before 1920, the British Empire had already ruled over so much domain that it was said that the sun never sets on the British Empire. The main cause of this was the insatiable need of raw materials to keep feeding the British industrial machine, as well as the need for new markets to sell British goods. For this warm-up, I want you to explain in your own words what imperialism means. Also explain in your own words the four main reasons nations pursued imperialistic policies. You can think about anything that we've done in world history so far, but you can also think about U.S. history and how the U.S. also has tended to have imperialistic policies. Once you're done with that, choose one of those main reasons and draw a political comic similar to the one that you see above to show that imperialistic policy. You'll have about 15 minutes to complete this.
The blast that tears the sky, such that for roots and native
The new imperialism occurred in the late 19th century and shares some similarities with old imperialism. The new imperialists also wanted natural resources not available in their homelands, including gold, diamonds, tea, and more. Like the old imperialism, indigenous people suffered heavy population losses. With the invention of the rapid-fire guns toward the end of the 1800s, the indigenous people of Africa had no chance at all. There were several documented incidents of tens of thousands of natives being executed or killed in combat by European imperialists. Also, like the old imperialists, new imperialism grew partly out of the sense of competition among major European powers, including Britain, France, Germany, and Italy. But new imperialism was unique too. In the 19th century, imperialism was motivated at least partly by the enormous population pressures in Europe and the desire of smaller nations like Britain to have a place for population to overflow. Also, new imperialism involved the search not only for new sources of raw materials, but also for new markets for manufactured goods. In some ways, industrialization encouraged imperialism. There were plenty of intangible reasons for imperialism too. Historians have adopted the terminology Old Imperialism and New Imperialism to distinguish between the two distinct periods of imperialism and expansion in European history. The Old Imperialism of the 15th and 16th centuries featured primarily Portugal, Spain, England, and France, exploring uncharted lands in search of gold and other treasures. These nations also hoped to find new lands full of souls that could be added to their kingdoms. They were indeed in sense of a competition between European powers that drove them to explore and colonize. Under the system of the old imperialism, natives suffered from all sorts of things brought on by Europeans, including slavery, war, and disease. In extreme cases, entire civilizations died off from war, disease, or even both. Here we have a chart that shows 8 different reasons why Europeans were motivated to take on imperialistic policies. Everything going from the Industrial Revolution, European nationalism, missionary activity, building of military and naval bases to basically control and the areas that they colonize, but also to protect their trade. Also, some of these places were really getting overcrowded, especially Britain, so they needed a place to dump their unwanted and excess population. It also was a way to create social and economic opportunities for people. Humanitarian reasons, a lot of the Europeans looked at these people in places like Africa, India, seeing them as poor and destitute and thinking that they needed to raise them up, which leads to the final one, European racism. Okay, all of these are valid and all of them are being questioned by historians. Just like everything else in history, nothing is actually 100%. And over time, as people sift through things and as we look back at it with a different perspective, we tend to argue these main points. But I'm going to go through 4 of the major ones that most historians can agree to. Since the beginning of absolute monarchies, nationalism had been on the rise in Europe. And it was no different when it came to imperialism. Nationalistic competition amongst European powers led an extension of power struggles, not only in Europe, but also in Africa and Asia. The British, especially, liked to believe they were merely defending their empire when they were developing their colonies overseas. Another common reason for imperialism is this almost macho sense of exploration and heroism that follows the ideas of imperialism. This idea of the white man from Europe on the known world traveling to the dark and unknown world of, let's say, like Africa or like an exotic place like China or Japan or India. You can really get a good sense of that in the literature of the time. A good example would be Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, where there's a description of Romans going up the Thames River in Britain and talking about at the time the Romans went there, it was like exploring. It was untouched land, just like how Europeans today, or at least during this day, were traveling down these unexplored lands as they went up the Congo River. Another main reason was the Industrial Revolution itself. Industrial economics meant that you had to have a steady source of raw materials in order to keep your factories humming. And Britain, being an island and having very few natural resources of its own to actually produce into goods, it needed to seek out colonies in order to produce those raw materials that were necessary in order to make those goods. Now, the problem was is that eventually you were going to run out of markets within Europe, so you needed the markets overseas to actually sell to people and to keep those factories going. One of the problems with the Industrial Revolution is that anytime that you had too much of a product, it would cause a slowdown, and that slowdown in turn would cause economic and political instability in that home nation. So it was very important to continue to expand their markets to keep the Industrial Revolution humming. Many Europeans justified the expansion into Africa and other unindustrialized areas by calling the moves social Darwinism. Charles Darwin built upon the already existing theory called evolution. In his shocking books on the origin of species and the descent of man, he outlined his take on evolution and natural selection. He maintained that species that are weaker tend to die out, and species with superior traits tend to survive, hence the idea of survival of the fittest. Contemporary Europeans applied this idea to imperialism. They pointed out that the stronger species, Europeans, would eventually overrun or stamp out the inferior species, the non-whites, simply by using the laws of nature. These Europeans saw imperialism as part of the natural order of things. India, under British rule, serves as a perfect example of such an ideology. The British followed the Portuguese into India in the 1600s, but had more staying power. The powerful British East India Company succeeded in subjugating India in its entirety by the mid-1800s. The Indians tried multiple times to rid the oppressive British, having one last go in 1857 and 1858 during the Sepoy Rebellion. The British put down the Great Rebellion and continued to rule India. A tiny detachment of Brits administered the government there. They were elitists who considered the Indians inferior, just as any other Europeans thought of Africans. The British did bring some improvements to India, including some education and massive miles of railway. However, except for a few Indians who worked as government officials, the majority of India's population saw no change in the quality of their life. To help better illustrate this, I've included a clip from CNN's Millennium talking about Charles Darwin and how it applies to imperialism.
In 1800, Joseph Haydn published his oratorio, The Creation. It tells the biblical story of Genesis. God made the world in 6 days and crowned his creation with man. In the 19th century, this popular belief was challenged by a radical secular idea. It was developed here in an English village in the course of a quest for a new understanding of nature. Scientists already knew the world was very old. They believed that animals had evolved from primitive forms. What they did not know was how. Charles Darwin was the first to solve the problem with his theory of evolution. His ideas arose when he was an amateur young scientist on board a round-the-world survey for the Royal Navy. In the Pacific, Darwin explored the Galapagos Islands.
never dreamed that islands would be so differently tenanted. Temples filled with the varied production of God and nature. These species in the natural economy of the archipelago filled me with wonder.
Here, Darwin began to realize that species changed by adapting to local conditions.
We seem near to answering that mystery of mysteries, the first appearance of new beings on Earth.
But it wasn't just animals that adapted to their environment. At Tierra del Fuego, the very tip of the southern hemisphere, Darwin encountered the people living almost naked in this harsh environment.
Man in his natural state was so beastly, so vile, a foul, naked, snuffling thing.
Here he began to see humans for what they are, well-adapted apes. Darwin returned from his voyage with collections of specimens that gained him respect among professional scientists. Back home, he continued to gather evidence of how life had evolved and analyzed it. But the tranquility of his life in the country masked an emotional turmoil. Darwin had married his cousin. Some of his children were sick, struggling to survive. When one daughter died, Darwin was devastated.
It was impossible for me ever to feel joy again. I was no longer sure of God's existence.
It made him see his own family as casualties of nature. Everywhere he looked, he saw that what drove the evolution of species was the struggle for survival.
Nature is savage, and the struggle must be won by the strongest.
His theory was further developed when he joined his local pigeon club. Here, fanciers selected individual birds and bred from them to enhance their speed, size, or beauty. Darwin saw that nature itself acted as the supreme selector.
These facts have thoroughly convinced me that species have been modified during a long course of descent.
Darwin observed that what was true of pigeons must be true of higher animals.
Man, wonderful man, is not a deity. He possesses some of the same instincts and feelings as animals.
Did man evolve like other animals? Or did intervention by God make him special? For 20 years, Darwin suppressed his theory. Racked with anxiety, he feared disgrace from religious critics and professional rivals. He was finally forced to publish when he learned that another naturalist had come to the same conclusions. On the Origin of Species was published in 1859. It sold out on the first day. The book horrified the religious establishment. Man's sense of goodness and beauty were not God-given, simply characteristics that had evolved. Darwin was lampooned. But some took up Darwin's ideas and applied them to human societies. If aggression was natural, so was war.
The civilized races of man will almost completely replace the savage races throughout the world.
Darwin's theory was hijacked by imperialists to substantiate a political program. The belief that the White West, with its superior machines, was destined to prevail and was justified in marching across the world to conquer. The West's firepower and mobility became unstoppable. Nowhere was the West's domination more clearly seen than in Africa. At the end of the century, Africa became the victim of a wholesale colonial takeover. Here, Europe's industrialized powers played out their own battle for the survival of the fittest.
Rudyard Kipling, born in India and educated in England, earned a great deal of popularity for writing stories like the children's favorite, The Jungle Book. However, Kipling also earned a measure of notoriety for his poem, White Man's Burden. Written in 1899 to encourage the United States to invest in the development of the civilization of the Philippines, the poem reflected much the sentiment of Europeans towards imperialism. The following lines give an odd sense of duty that the Europeans claimed. Take up the white man's burden, the savage wars of peace. Fill full the mouth of famine, and bid the sickness cease. Europeans saw Africans, native Australians, Pacific Islanders, and others as primitive savages plagued by war, poverty, disease, and ignorance. The sense of duty to civilize the non-white peoples and the unindustrialized lands ranged from genuine religious and humanitarian concerns at one end of the spectrum to snobbery and arrogance at the other. Some Europeans wanted to spread Christianity, while others wanted to prove that the non-white peoples were inferior beings. Many believed that administration of the non-white people by the European governments would keep the savages safe from tribal warfare. Now what I'm going to have you guys do now is to study two different types of poems. One, The White Man's Burden, and the other one, kind of poking fun at the whole idea of white man's burden. Compare and contrast these, and that's how we're going to be ending class today.